On May 2nd, 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn walked through the gates of the Tower of London. 3 years earlier, she'd entered as a bride crowned in gold. This time, she wore chains. What followed wasn't just an execution. It was 17 days of calculated psychological torture designed to shatter her mind before they took her head. The truth about those final days is darker than any tale you've been told. If you want to know what really happened in that stone prison, hit subscribe, because what comes next will change everything you thought you knew about Anne Boleyn's death. April 1536. The court at Greenwich Palace buzzed with rumors, but no one could have predicted the storm about to break. Behind closed doors, Thomas Cromwell had begun weaving a web that would trap a queen. It started with whispers. Mark Smeaton, a young musician in the royal household, was arrested without warning. He wasn't nobility. He had no powerful family to protect him. Within hours of his interrogation, Smeaton confessed to adultery with Queen Anne Boleyn. The confession came suspiciously fast, and historians believe torture played its part, though no records admit it outright. One man's broken will become the first thread in a tapestry of accusations. The net widened quickly. On May Day, while the court celebrated with tournaments and feasting, Sir Henry Norris rode beside King Henry. Norris was the groom of the stool, one of Henry's most trusted companions. By evening, he was under arrest. The king had left the festivities abruptly, his face dark with rage. No explanation was given. Norris was taken to the Tower, bewildered and protesting his innocence. Then came the charges, and they were designed to horrify. Anne Boleyn stood accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. But the accusations went further. She was charged with plotting the king's death, with using witchcraft to seduce him into marriage, with corrupting the men around her through what the indictments called her frail and carnal appetites. The language was deliberate, calculated to disgust. Court documents described vile provocations and base conversations. They spoke of tongue-kissing between Anne and her brother, of secret meetings in her private chambers, of laughter and gifts exchanged with her alleged lovers. The words painted Anne not as a queen, but as a monster of depravity. 5 men were named: Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn, her own flesh and blood. The accusations claimed Anne had seduced them through promises, through manipulations, through conversations that began innocent and ended in sin. What made the charges truly chilling wasn't their brutality. It was their precision. Cromwell had crafted accusations that couldn't be easily disproven. Private conversations, moments behind closed doors, glances and gestures witnesses claimed to have seen. How do you prove you didn't share a forbidden look? How do you defend yourself against whispers? But cracks existed in the foundation of lies. Many historians who studied the indictments discovered something disturbing. 3/4 of the dates listed for Anne's supposed crimes were impossible. On those days, either Anne or the accused men weren't at the locations claimed. Some were miles apart. Others were documented elsewhere entirely. The evidence was fabricated. But in the spring of 1536, with Cromwell orchestrating every move and Henry's rage fueling the machinery of accusation, facts didn't matter. The trap had closed. And Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was about to discover that crowns offer no protection when a king decides you must fall. May 2nd, 1536, Anne Boleyn woke as Queen of England. By noon, she was a prisoner. The arrest came without ceremony. No formal charges were read. No time was given to prepare or protest. Royal guards simply appeared at Greenwich Palace with orders to take her immediately. Anne had been watching a tennis match, trying to maintain the appearance of normalcy, while rumors swirled through the court like poison. When the men approached, she knew. The journey to the Tower of London was made by barge along the Thames. Anne sat in silence, watching the riverbank slip past, the same route she'd traveled in triumph during her coronation procession just 3 years earlier. Then, the crowds had cheered. Now, only the rhythmic splash of oars broke the quiet. They didn't bring her through Traitor's Gate, as many later believed. Instead, the barge docked at the court gate in Byward Tower. As Anne stepped onto the stones, her legs buckled. She collapsed, and for several moments couldn't rise. The guards waited. Her attendants rushed forward. When she finally stood, her first words were questions that would haunt the records. "Where is my father? Where is my sweet brother?" No one answered. Anne was led through the tower's passages, each step taking her deeper into the fortress that had witnessed countless deaths. She demanded to know the charges against her. Again, silence. Her voice grew desperate. "Shall I go into a dungeon?" She asked the question like a plea, already imagining herself thrown into darkness. Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, answered with words that must have felt like mockery. No, she would not go to a dungeon. She would be kept in the royal apartments. The very same rooms where she had stayed before her coronation, where she had dressed in cloth of gold and prepared to be crowned. Now those chambers would serve as her cell. The psychological cruelty was exquisite. She would be surrounded by luxury while awaiting death. Tapestries on the walls, fine furniture, windows overlooking Tower Green. But the door would be guarded. The walls would be her prison. And every beautiful thing around her would remind her of what she'd lost. Kingston assigned 4 ladies to attend Anne's needs. On the surface, this seemed like respect for her royal status. But Anne understood the truth quickly. These women weren't there to comfort her. They were there to watch, to listen, to report every word she spoke back to Cromwell. Anne's mind raced with questions. What evidence existed? Who had spoken against her? What had they claimed? But Kingston offered nothing, no details, no accusations she could refute. Just the stone walls and the waiting, and the terrible certainty that somewhere beyond her reach, her fate was being decided by men who had already chosen her guilt. The rooms that should have offered comfort became instruments of torture. Anne paced the royal apartments, her footsteps echoing against stone floors. She'd walked as a queen, preparing for glory. Now every corner held ghosts of what she'd been. The window seat where she'd sat for her coronation portrait. The mirror where she'd adjusted her crown. The bed where she'd slept in triumph. All of it transformed to a museum of her own downfall. The 4 ladies moved through the chambers like shadows, always present, always watching. Anne tried speaking to them, searching for allies or at least sympathy. But their eyes remained guarded. She would begin to confide a thought, then stop mid-sentence, realizing her words would be in Cromwell's hands by nightfall. Trust became impossible. Even her own voice felt like a betrayal. Kingston visited regularly, his face a mask of professional courtesy. Anne bombarded him with questions. What were the specific charges? Who had accused her? What evidence existed? She needed to know what she was fighting against, what defense she could mount. But Kingston revealed nothing. The accusations remained shapeless, impossible to grasp or refute. This was psychological warfare at its most refined. Anne's mind filled the silence with horrors worse than reality might have been. Had someone twisted an innocent conversation into evidence of conspiracy? Had a moment of laughter with a courtier been painted as seduction? Without facts, her imagination became her torturer. She oscillated between emotions like a pendulum. 1 hour she stood tall, demanding her rights as queen, insisting on her innocence with fierce conviction. The next she collapsed in tears, overwhelmed by the impossibility of her situation. Then rage would surface, directed at the injustice, at the cowardice of false accusations. Then fear again, raw and consuming. Kingston documented everything, each mood swing, each desperate question, each moment of strength or weakness. His reports traveled to Cromwell, who studied them like a physician examining symptoms. The goal wasn't just imprisonment. It was the systematic dismantling of Anne's mental defenses. Days blurred together. Anne had no access to legal counsel, no opportunity to confront her accusers, no way to gather evidence in her defense. She existed in a suspended state, knowing terrible charges hung over her, but unable to see their shape clearly enough to fight them. The isolation was calculated and complete. Every face she saw belonged to someone in Henry's employ. Every conversation was monitored, every tear noted. She'd once commanded these halls, and now they commanded her. Outside her windows, life in the tower continued. Guards changed shifts. Prisoners were led to interrogations. Somewhere beyond the walls, London went about its business. But Anne remained frozen in her gilded cage, waiting for an accusation she couldn't see, and a trial whose outcome seemed inevitable. The apartments weren't just her prison. They were the stage where her psychological destruction was methodically performed. May 10th brought the first terrible certainty. A grand jury declared there was sufficient evidence to proceed. The machinery of justice, already corrupted beyond recognition, began grinding toward its predetermined conclusion. The formal charges revealed the full scope of Cromwell's invention. Anne stood accused of entertaining malice against the king himself, of procuring men as her lovers through base conversations and kisses, of conspiracy to murder Henry so she could marry one of her alleged paramours. The accusations were monstrous, and they came with names attached. Sir Henry Norris, the king's trusted groom of the stool; Sir William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber; Sir Francis Weston, barely more than a boy; Mark Smeaton, the musician who'd already confessed under circumstances no one would examine too closely; and George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's own brother. The indictments listed specific dates and locations. October 1533 at Westminster. The following month at Greenwich. Multiple encounters throughout 1534 and 1535. The details seemed damning until anyone bothered to check. Historians who later examined the records discovered the impossible truth. 3/4 of the dates made no sense. Anne wasn't at the palace as named, or the accused men were documented elsewhere entirely. Some were separated by miles on the days they supposedly committed adultery. But on May 12th, no one in Westminster Hall cared about impossible dates. 4 of the men faced their trial first. The proceedings were swift. Evidence was presented. Witnesses testified. The accused defended themselves. Only Mark Smeaton maintained his guilty plea. The others protested their innocence with increasing desperation. The verdict surprised no one. Guilty. All 4 condemned to death. 3 days later, Anne and George faced their separate trials. 27 peers assembled to judge them, including Anne's own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. Anne was brought first. She stood before the court with remarkable composure, answering each charge with clarity. She admitted only to giving money to Francis Weston, something she'd done for many courtiers as acts of royal patronage. Nothing more. Then came George's trial. He defended himself brilliantly, dismantling accusations point by point. But Cromwell had prepared one final trap. A note was handed to George containing a question he was instructed not to read aloud. It suggested the king suffered from impotence, and that Princess Elizabeth might not be Henry's daughter. George read it aloud anyway. Perhaps he thought exposing the absurdity would help his cause. Instead, he'd given his enemies exactly what they wanted: evidence of slander against the king, proof of malicious gossip. The words sealed his fate. The verdicts came unanimously. Guilty. Anne heard herself stripped of her titles, though she would keep the designation of queen. Her sentence was pronounced by her uncle, tears streaming down his face as he spoke the words: death, by beheading or burning, at the king's pleasure. The trap had closed completely. Now only the waiting remained. Henry chose the sword. The sentence gave him options. beheading or burning at the stake, both acceptable under law for a queen convicted of treason. Henry selected beheading, and his court praised him for his mercy. But mercy had nothing to do with it. This was about control. The king sent specific instructions to Kingston at the Tower. Omit nothing in the arrangements. Every detail of Anne's execution must be orchestrated precisely. Henry didn't just want her dead. He wanted her death to be a performance, staged exactly as he envisioned it. He ordered a swordsman brought from Calais, not the traditional axe used for English executions, but a sword, the French method. It required Anne to kneel upright rather than place her head on a block. More elegant, some said. More theatrical, others recognized. The choice revealed Henry's obsession with controlling even the manner of her final moment. Anne learned of the swordsman and felt something like relief. A sword meant a cleaner death than the axe. Quicker. The executioners from Calais were known for their skill. She told her attendants she heard the man was very good, and she had such a little neck. She even laughed as she said it, placing her hands around her throat to demonstrate. The laughter wasn't humor. It was the sound of a mind trying to process the unprocessable. She'd been told when she would die, and the knowledge should have brought some grim closure. Instead, it opened a new chapter of torture. Because Henry didn't set an immediate date. The execution would happen soon, Kingston assured her, but not yet. Preparations needed to be made. The swordsman had to travel from France. The scaffold had to be built. Details required attention. So Anne returned to her apartments to wait. Days stretched ahead with no clear end. She knew death was coming, but not when. The uncertainty became its own form of torment. Meanwhile, beyond her windows, the 4 men were executed on Tower Hill, May 17th. Anne would have heard the commotion, the crowds gathering, perhaps even the distant sound of the scaffold being tested. Her brother George died that day, proclaiming his innocence to the end. Anne wasn't allowed to say goodbye. She wasn't permitted to send him a final message or receive one from him. Henry had denied her that mercy along with every other. The last time she'd seen George was at his trial, watching him fight brilliantly for his life and lose anyway. Now he was gone. The others too. 5 men dead because of accusations linked to her. The guilt would have been crushing, even knowing the charges were lies. They died in her orbit, caught in the gravitational pull of her fall. And still Anne waited in her apartments, knowing her turn was coming, but not when. The psychological warfare had entered its cruelest phase. Time became Anne's enemy. In the days after sentencing, she existed in a state of suspension between life and death. The execution date remained unannounced. Each morning she woke, wondering if this would be the day. Each night she survived felt less like reprieve and more like prolonged agony. The 4 ladies continued their constant presence. They spoke little, but their eyes never stopped watching. Anne found herself censoring even her thoughts, afraid that somehow her expressions would be reported back to Cromwell. The surveillance was suffocating. Her mood swung violently, but not from instability. They were the natural response to an impossible situation. 1 hour she'd feel a strange calm, almost acceptance. She'd pray quietly, preparing her soul for what must come. Then suddenly, panic would surge through her, and she'd pace the room like a caged animal, her breath coming in gasps. Hope arrived in unexpected moments, cruel in its persistence. Perhaps Henry would change his mind. Perhaps someone would uncover proof of the false accusations. Perhaps a messenger would arrive with a pardon. These thoughts weren't comfort. They were torture, because each time hope flickered to life, reality crushed it again. Kingston's visits became a kind of rhythm. He'd enter with his formal courtesy, ask after her needs, reveal nothing of substance, then leave. Anne began asking him the same questions repeatedly, not because she forgot his non-answers, but because asking felt like doing something. Action against helplessness. Sleep became nearly impossible. The apartments that once symbolized her power now felt like they were closing in. At night, shadows moved across the tapestries in patterns that seemed deliberately menacing. The silence was worse than any sound. She'd lie awake listening to guards change, watch outside her door, their footsteps marking time. Food arrived at regular intervals. Anne picked at meals without tasting them. Her attendants noted she ate little. How could she? Each bite felt absurd when death waited somewhere in the near future. Yet her body insisted on hunger anyway. Another betrayal. The isolation gnawed at her mind in ways the accusations never could. She had no one to talk to honestly, no friend who could speak freely, no counsel to advise her. Even her father and brother were kept away, the latter already dead by week's end. She existed in a bubble of enforced solitude surrounded by people. Cromwell had designed this perfectly. The goal wasn't just execution. It was the systematic destruction of her psychological defenses first. Break her mind, then take her life. Leave her so hollowed out by uncertainty and isolation that when death finally came, it would almost be welcome. And it was working. Anne felt herself fragmenting. The queen who stood so confidently before her accusers was being replaced by someone she didn't recognize. Someone desperate. Someone beginning to doubt everything, even her own memories. The first week was only the beginning. The second week brought a shift in tactics. Archbishop Cranmer arrived at the Tower. Anne must have felt a surge of something like hope when she heard. Cranmer had been her ally, one of the few who'd supported her marriage to Henry. Perhaps he brought news. Perhaps he'd come to help. Instead, he came to hear her confession, and to ask her to agree that her marriage to Henry had never been valid. The request was staggering in its cruelty. Anne was condemned to die for adultery against a husband Cromwell now wanted her to admit she'd never truly married. The contradiction didn't matter. Henry wanted his marriage erased as thoroughly as he wanted Anne eliminated. No loose ends. No legitimate marriage meant Elizabeth would be declared illegitimate. Everything Anne had fought for would be wiped away. Anne agreed. What choice did she have? Perhaps she thought cooperation would buy mercy for her daughter. Perhaps she was simply too exhausted to fight anymore. That night, Kingston reported she seemed almost cheerful. She spoke of being sent to a nunnery, of living out her days in religious seclusion. The hope lasted hours before reality returned. There would be no nunnery, no exile, just death. Cromwell's psychological campaign reached its peak during these days. His strategy evolved from simple isolation to active manipulation. Suggestions were planted through the attending ladies. Implications dropped into conversations. Had Anne considered that perhaps some of her actions, innocent as they were, might have been misinterpreted? Could she see how others might have misconstrued her kindness as something more? The goal was insidious. Make her question her own memory. Plant seeds of doubt about her innocence. Not to force a false confession, but to destabilize her completely. To make her wonder if somehow, in some way she couldn't remember, she might actually be responsible. It was working. The confident woman who demanded evidence and proclaimed her innocence now found herself replaying conversations from years past. Had she been too friendly with Norris? Had she laughed too freely with Weston? She knew she'd done nothing wrong, yet the constant insinuation made her doubt even that certainty. This was the true genius of Cromwell's torture. No physical pain, no rack or blade, just the slow, methodical dismantling of a person's sense of reality. Take someone strong and make them question everything, even their own perception of truth. Anne stopped demanding evidence. She stopped protesting as fiercely, not because she'd accepted guilt, but because the fight had been gradually drained from her. Each day of waiting, each unanswered question, each subtle suggestion that maybe she was somehow complicit in her own destruction. Henry had refused to see her even once. No explanation. No confrontation. No chance to defend herself to the man who Dee once claimed to love her so desperately he Dee broken with Rome. That abandonment cut deeper than any accusation. By the end of the second week, Anne was no longer the woman who'd entered the tower. The transformation was nearly complete. May 18th. Finally, a date. Anne would die at 8 o'clock in the morning. She spent the night preparing. No sleep, just prayer and the grim work of readying herself for death. She made her final confession. She organized her few possessions. She thought about what words she'd speak on the scaffold, knowing they'd be her last chance to shape how history remembered her. By dawn she was dressed and waiting. The hours crawled past. 7 o'clock came. Then 8. The appointed time arrived and passed with no summons from Kingston. The scaffold wasn't ready. Anne had spent an entire night facing her mortality, marshaling every ounce of courage to meet her end with dignity, and now she had to keep waiting. The psychological impact was devastating. All that mental preparation, all that acceptance she'd fought so hard to achieve, and it meant nothing. Death had been postponed. Kingston delivered the news with his usual professional detachment. A few more hours. Everything would be arranged shortly. He apologized for the delay, as if he were announcing a postponed dinner rather than an execution. Anne returned to her chambers, exhausted beyond measure. She'd been awake all night. Her nerves were scraped raw from anticipation, and now she had to sustain that terrible readiness for an indefinite period. How do you prepare to die twice in one day? The delay wasn't an accident. Henry could have ensured the scaffold was ready. He could have set the execution for noon or afternoon, giving adequate time. But he didn't. The postponement served a purpose, whether intentional or not. It maximized Anne's suffering. She tried to maintain her composure before the watching ladies, but the strain showed in her face. The night without sleep, the emotional exhaustion of preparing for death, the fresh uncertainty about when the end would actually come. It was all visible in her movements, her expressions, the way she held herself. The hours dragged on through the morning. Anne moved through her rooms like a ghost, too tired to sit still, but too drained to do anything productive. The waiting was its own form of death, a slow erosion of everything that made her herself. This was the final torture. After 17 days of psychological warfare, after systematic isolation and manipulation, after being denied every comfort and certainty, Anne now faced the ultimate cruelty. She'd been forced to confront her death, accept it, prepare for it, and then continue living anyway. No closure, no relief. Just more waiting in a state of suspended execution. By the time the sun began its descent toward evening, Anne had lived an entire lifetime in a single day. She died internally at 8 o'clock that morning, but her body remained, trapped in the tower, forced to endure hour after hour of an existence that should have already ended. Tomorrow, they told her. Tomorrow for certain. She had to face another night, another dawn, another preparation for death. The psychological torture was complete. May 19th, 1536, the second dawn. Anne had survived another sleepless night, but this time something was different. A strange clarity settled over her. The uncertainty that had tortured her for 17 days was finally gone. Today would be the day. No more waiting. No more delays. Just the end. She turned her attention to the details she could control. Her appearance mattered, not from vanity, but from pride. She would go to her death as a queen, not a broken prisoner. Every choice she made that morning was an act of defiance against those who tried to destroy her. The gown she selected spoke volumes. A crimson kirtle beneath a dark gray damask gown trimmed in fur. Crimson, the color of martyrdom. She knew the symbolism. Everyone watching would know it too. Over this she placed a mantle of ermine, the white fur reserved for royalty. They'd stripped her of her titles, but she would wear the trappings of her rank to the scaffold. Her hair was covered by a traditional English gable hood. She arranged it carefully, ensuring every strand was tucked away. Practical, since her neck needed to be fully exposed for the sword, but also dignified, controlled, nothing left to chance or chaos. 2 attendants would accompany her. They moved around her quietly that morning, helping with the final preparations, their faces pale with grief. Anne spoke to them gently, offering them comfort rather than seeking it for herself. She'd found a kind of peace in the acceptance of the inevitable. Witnesses who saw her that morning reported something unexpected. She looked almost gay, they said, as if she wasn't going to die at all. There was a lightness to her movements, a brightness in her manner that seemed impossible given the circumstances. But those who understood recognized what they were seeing. This wasn't denial or delusion. It was armor. Anne had split herself into 2 people. The woman who was terrified and heartbroken, and the queen who would face death with grace. She'd chosen which one the world would see. She gave her final confession, unburdening her soul one last time. Whatever happened after death, she wanted to meet it with a clear conscience. She'd maintained her innocence throughout, and she wouldn't change that now. No false confession would pass her lips, not even to ease her way. As the morning progressed, Anne kept glancing toward the door, listening for footsteps. The scaffold was ready this time. The swordsman had arrived from Calais and was waiting. The crowd had assembled on Tower Green. Everything was prepared, except Anne's own mind, which couldn't quite believe this was real. After 17 days of psychological torture, after so many hours of waiting and uncertainty, the moment was finally here. Yet it still felt surreal, like something happening to someone else. Kingston would come soon. The walk to the scaffold would begin. And Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England, would face the final test of her courage. Kingston appeared at the door shortly after dawn. The time had come. Anne rose smoothly, her movements steady despite 2 nights without sleep. She nodded to her attendants, and together they stepped into the corridor. The walk from the royal apartments to Tower Green was mercifully short, but every step carried the weight of finality. The scaffold had been erected on the north side of the White Tower, facing what would later become Waterloo Barracks. The same ground where Anne had been celebrated during her coronation festivities now hosted the platform of her death. The symmetry must have struck her as they walked. This would be a private execution, not the public spectacle of Tower Hill, where the 5 men had died. Henry had granted her that much, though whether from mercy or shame was unclear. The crowd was small, carefully selected. Nobles and officials who needed to witness the sentence carried out. No common masses to jeer or mourn. Anne walked with her head high, her posture regal. The ermine mantle caught the morning light. She looked every inch a queen despite everything. Witnesses later remarked on her composure, how she seemed almost otherworldly in her calm. But beneath the surface, her nerves were screaming. She kept glancing back over her shoulder as she walked, a nervous habit she couldn't quite suppress. Looking at what? The apartments she'd left behind? Some last glimpse of the world? Or simply the involuntary response of a mind that couldn't quite accept what was happening? The French swordsman stood waiting near the scaffold. He wore no mask, as was the custom in Calais. Anne would see his face. He would see hers. The sword lay ready, hidden in straw, so she wouldn't have to look at it until the final moment. Henry had insisted on this executioner specifically, brought him all the way from France, because English headsmen used axes, and Henry wanted something different, something more elegant. The choice made Anne's death feel choreographed, theatrical. Every detail controlled by the king, who'd once promised to love her forever. Anne noticed the executioner's every movement. When he shifted his weight, her eyes followed. When he adjusted his position, she tracked him. Was it fear? Anticipation? Simply the human instinct to watch the instrument of your own death? The crowd waited in tense silence. Protocol demanded they be fully assembled before the execution could proceed. Anne stood near the scaffold base, breathing the spring air, feeling the sun on her face. Ordinary sensations made extraordinary by the knowledge they would soon end. Kingston stood beside her, ready to escort her up the steps when the moment came. The platform loomed above them, simple wooden construction that had been hammered together in hours. Nothing elaborate needed, just a raised stage for death. Anne looked up at it, measuring the height with her eyes. Soon she would climb those steps and kneel on that wood, and everything she'd been would cease to exist. Anne climbed the scaffold steps without assistance. The wooden platform creaked slightly under her weight. She stood at its center, surveying the assembled witnesses. These men had come to watch a queen die. She would give them a performance they'd never forget, though not in the way Henry might have hoped. The moment demanded words. Tradition required the condemned to speak before execution. What Anne said now would echo through history, and she knew it. Every syllable needed to be chosen with care, because her daughter's life might depend on it. She began in a clear, steady voice that carried across Tower Green. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." The words were careful, calculated. She acknowledged the legal process without admitting guilt. A fine distinction, but an important one. She wouldn't give her enemies the satisfaction of a confession, but she also wouldn't directly criticize the king and endanger her family further. Then came the most difficult part. She had to praise Henry, the man who'd orchestrated her destruction, the husband who'd abandoned her to die on fabricated charges, the father of her child, who is allowing that child's mother to be executed. "I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." Some who heard detected bitter irony in those words. How could she call Henry merciful while standing on a scaffold built at his command? But Anne's motivations were transparent to those who understood. Elizabeth was 3 years old. Anne's father and remaining family members still lived. Every word of praise for Henry was a plea for their safety. To me, he was always a good, a gentle and sovereign lord. The lies must have tasted like poison, but she spoke them clearly. This was her final act of motherhood, protecting Elizabeth by refusing to give Henry any excuse to harm her further. She made no mention of her innocence, no dramatic declaration that she'd been wrongly accused. That omission spoke louder than any protest could have. Everyone present knew what she wasn't saying, and why. Anne turned to prayer for her final words. Her voice took on a different quality, less performative and more genuine. "Jesus, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." She repeated the prayer several times, the words becoming a rhythm, a meditation, a way to quiet her racing mind and prepare for what came next. The crowd stood in respectful silence, watching this woman find her peace in the shadow of death. Anne finished speaking and looked toward her attendants. The time for words had passed. Now came the final preparations, the removal of the mantle, the arrangement of her hair, the last mechanical actions before the sword fell. Anne's attendants stepped forward, their hands trembling as they removed the ermine mantle from her shoulders. The heavy fur slipped away, leaving her in the gray damask gown. She stood lighter now, unburdened of the last symbol of royalty. She reached up and carefully lifted the gable hood from her head. Her hands were steady, controlled. She tucked every strand of hair under a white coif, ensuring nothing would obstruct the blade's path. The action was mechanical, practical, yet carried profound intimacy. She was preparing her own body for death. Anne turned to her ladies one final time. Their faces were wet with tears they could no longer contain. She spoke to them softly, words of comfort and farewell. She asked them to pray for her soul. They nodded, unable to speak, their grief too overwhelming for words. One of the attendants held the blindfold, a white cloth that would spare Anne from seeing the sword's final approach, and allowed her to tie it gently over her eyes. The world disappeared into darkness. Now there was only sound and sensation. The morning breeze on her face, the wood beneath her knees, a hammering of her own heart. She knelt upright in the French style, her spine straight, her hands clasped in prayer. The position felt unnatural, vulnerable. In English executions, the condemned placed their head on a block, facing down. But this required her to kneel tall, neck exposed, trusting the swordsman's skill completely, and continued her prayer aloud. "Jesu, receive my soul." The words came faster now, a lifeline in the darkness. "O Lord God, have pity on my soul." Her voice remained clear, despite everything. The executioner had been trained for this moment. He called out suddenly to his assistant, asking him to bring the sword. His voice came from Anne's left side. Instinctively, Anne turned her head toward the sound. The movement was pure reflex, a human response to unexpected noise. As she turned, her neck extended perfectly, creating the ideal angle. The swordsman had already moved to her right. The sword was in his hands, raised and ready. The distraction had been deliberate, a technique to ensure a clean strike without the condemned tensing at the wrong moment. The blade fell in a single swift arc. It was over instantly. No second blow needed, no suffering prolonged. The swordsman's skill had been everything promised. Anne Boleyn felt nothing beyond one bright moment, then darkness of a different kind. The crowd stood in absolute silence. No cheers, no celebration. Just the weight of what they'd witnessed settling over Tower Green like morning fog. From the Tower wharf, cannons fired in sequence. The sound rolled across London, announcing to the city that the execution had been completed. The Queen was dead. Anne's ladies moved forward through their tears, gathering what remained to prepare for burial. The execution had been meticulously planned, every detail choreographed, the swordsman imported from France, the scaffold built to specifications, the timing calculated for maximum impact, but no one had arranged for a coffin. Anne's ladies stood on the scaffold in stunned silence, realizing the grotesque oversight. Their queen lay before them, and there was nothing to place her in. No casket waited. No burial preparations had been made. It was as if Henry had orchestrated her death so thoroughly that he forgotten she need burying afterward. The attendants wrapped Anne's head carefully in a white cloth, their hands shaking with grief and shock. They gathered her body in their arms, supporting the weight between them. But where could they take her? They couldn't simply carry a queen's remains through the tower like this. A yeoman warder rushed to find something, anything that could serve. He returned from the royal armory, carrying an old elm chest. It had once held bow staves and arrows, mundane military supplies. Now it would hold the body of a woman who'd been Queen of England. The chest was too small. Anne had joked about her little neck, but her body still had to be arranged carefully to fit inside the makeshift coffin. The indignity was staggering. From ermine and crimson to an arrow box in the span of minutes. Her ladies, half dead themselves from grief and exhaustion, lifted the chest between them. It wasn't heavy, but the burden of what it contained made every step feel impossible. They carried Anne from the scaffold across the short distance to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the small church within the tower grounds. The chapel stood quiet and dim after the brightness of Tower Green. Anne would be buried here, just steps from where she died. There would be no procession through London, no lying in state, no crowds of mourners. Just this small rushed burial in a fortress prison. The grave had been prepared in front of the high altar, a position of some honor at least. But the hole was shallow, dug quickly without ceremony. Anne would rest beside her brother George, who'd been buried there just 2 days earlier. The two of them, condemned together, would lie together in unmarked graves. No priest spoke elaborate funeral rites. No eulogy praised her life or mourned her loss. The ladies lowered the arrow chest into the earth, and workers began filling the grave immediately. Dirt covered the elm wood. Within minutes, the ground looked undisturbed. No marker was placed. No stone carved with her name or dates. Nothing indicated that England's queen lay buried in that spot. It was as if Henry wanted her erased from existence entirely, removed from history as thoroughly as she'd been removed from life. Anne Boleyn disappeared into the ground as anonymously as any common criminal, her final resting place known only to those who'd witnessed her burial. The sword ended Anne's life, but it wasn't what killed her. The 17 days between arrest and execution were the true weapon. A carefully designed campaign of psychological destruction that stripped away everything that made Anne Boleyn who she was. By the time she climbed the scaffold, the woman who'd challenged a king and changed a nation had already been hollowed out from within. This was never about justice. The trial was a performance with a predetermined outcome. Modern historians examining the case files have found the evidence laughable. 3/4 of the dates cited in the charges were impossible. Anne and her supposed lovers weren't even in the same locations when the alleged crimes occurred. The accusations of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, were fabricated from whole cloth. No credible evidence supported any of it. Only Mark Smeaton confessed, and his confession came under circumstances that strongly suggest torture, though official records conveniently omit those details. Henry needed Anne gone, and the law became his instrument. Not a mechanism for justice, but an engine of state power wielded to guarantee the result he wanted. Cromwell understood the assignment perfectly. Manufacture charges. Secure convictions. Execute quickly before anyone could examine the evidence too closely. The process was a legal travesty by any standard. Anne was denied adequate counsel, prevented from confronting her accusers properly, given no opportunity to gather evidence for her defense. The trial's outcome was decided before it began, and everyone involved knew it. But the true cruelty wasn't the false charges or rigged trial. It was the systematic psychological torture that preceded them. The isolation in familiar rooms turned prison. The constant surveillance by attendants who reported her every word. The denial of information about the accusations against her. The delays in execution that forced her to prepare for death multiple times. Each element was designed to break her mind before they broke her body, strip away her confidence, make her question her own memories, leave her so destabilized that by the end she could barely recognize herself. Henry orchestrated every detail personally, sending instructions to Kingston to omit nothing in the arrangements. He chose the method of execution. He imported the swordsman. He controlled the timing and the delays. Anne's death wasn't just punishment. It was theater, staged for maximum psychological impact. The implications extended far beyond one woman's fate. Anne's execution set a precedent that would haunt England for years. It demonstrated that no one was safe from false accusations when political necessity demanded a scapegoat. It showed how easily power could corrupt justice, how readily law could be twisted to serve tyranny. And it would cast a shadow over Anne's daughter Elizabeth, who grew up knowing her mother had been executed on her father's orders. 18 years later, Elizabeth would find herself imprisoned in the same tower on equally spurious charges, living through her own nightmare of psychological torment. The machinery of terror Henry created to destroy Anne didn't die with her. It only waited for its next victim. For 340 years, Anne Boleyn lay forgotten beneath the stones of St. Peter ad Vincula. November 9, 1876. The chapel needed renovations during Queen Victoria's reign. Workers prepared to restore the ancient building, unaware they were about to disturb graves that history had tried to erase. 5 men gathered in the chancel at noon. They carried a plan showing the approximate burial positions of those executed at the tower and interred beneath the chapel floor. The document was crude, based on scattered records and fading memories, but it was all they had. They lifted the pavement carefully, then began removing earth. 2 feet down, their tools struck something. Not the neat, separated graves they'd expected. Instead, bones lay heaped together in one concentrated spot, jumbled like discarded refuse. The remains of multiple people had been thrown into shallow graves with such haste that over centuries they'd collapsed into each other. The workers sifted through carefully, trying to distinguish one skeleton from another. It was grim, painstaking work. Among the bones, they identified a skeleton that matched descriptions of Anne Boleyn. Small frame, delicate build, positioned where records suggested she'd been buried. After more than 3 centuries, the queen lost to history was found again. 5 months passed while authorities debated what should be done. The Victorians were fascinated by their Tudor past, and the discovery of Anne Boleyn's remains captured public imagination. But how do you properly honor a queen who'd been deliberately dishonored in death? April 13, 1877. 7 men gathered at noon in the chapel for the reinterment. This time, Anne and the others found in that forgotten grave would be treated with the dignity they'd been denied. Craftsmen had prepared special caskets. Thick leaden coffers were placed inside oak boxes, built to last centuries. Each was fastened with copper screws, sealed against time's decay. On each coffin, an escutcheon was engraved with the deceased's name, the year of death, 1536, and the date of reinterment, 1877. The remains were placed carefully in their new resting places and lowered into properly prepared graves. This time, the holes were deep enough. This time, the burials were conducted with reverence. This time, someone remembered. After the earth was replaced and the floor restored, markers were set into the marble. Anne's grave was finally identified for visitors who came seeking her story. No elaborate monument, but at least acknowledgement. At least recognition that a queen lay here. The Victorians couldn't undo what had been done to Anne in life. They couldn't restore her reputation or give her back the years stolen by false accusations. But they could grant her what Henry had refused, a proper burial with her name attached. 340 years late, Anne Boleyn received a funeral befitting a queen. The woman Henry had tried to erase from history was remembered after all, pulled from obscurity by Victorian scholars who recognized an injustice that transcended centuries. Anne's execution sent shockwaves through England that reverberated for generations. The line of succession shifted overnight. Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate. The daughter of a queen became the bastard child of a traitor. Her household was reduced, her status diminished. She grew up in the shadow of her mother's execution, learning early that royal blood offered no protection from royal whims. The religious upheaval Anne had championed continued without her. The English Reformation didn't die on Tower Green, but it lost one of its most passionate advocates. The movement toward Protestantism stumbled forward, now driven entirely by Henry's political needs, rather than any genuine religious conviction. At court, terror became the new atmosphere. If a queen could be destroyed on fabricated charges, no one was safe. Courtiers watched their words. Friendships became dangerous. Any conversation could be twisted into evidence of treason. Cromwell's tactics had demonstrated how easily innocence could be painted as guilt. Henry moved on with disturbing speed. Within 24 hours of Anne's execution, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour. The wedding followed 11 days later. Anne's death was already becoming history. A problem solved, an obstacle removed. Henry showed no remorse, no second thoughts, no recognition of what he'd done. But history has a way of delivering justice that kings cannot control. 18 years after Anne's death, on May 19, 1554, the exact anniversary of her mother's execution, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The parallel was too perfect to be coincidence, though it likely was. Elizabeth was 20 years old, accused of treason by her half-sister Queen Mary. The charges were as questionable as those used against Anne. Elizabeth faced the same stone walls, the same isolation, the same psychological pressure. She understood intimately what her mother had endured. Unlike Anne, Elizabeth was released after 2 months, though she remained under house arrest afterward. The experience marked her permanently. When she eventually became queen, Elizabeth ruled with an acute awareness of how fragile power could be, how quickly accusations could destroy lives, how dangerous it was to trust anyone completely. Anne's story became a warning about unchecked authority and the corruption of justice for political ends. Her execution demonstrated how power could manufacture truth, how law could be weaponized, how innocence meant nothing when someone in authority decided you were guilty. The 17 days Anne spent in the Tower established a template for psychological torture that would be studied and replicated through history. The isolation, the uncertainty, the delays, the systematic dismantling of mental defenses. These weren't accidental cruelties. They were calculated tactics. Anne Boleyn died proclaiming her innocence, and history eventually vindicated her. Modern scholars universally recognize the charges as fabricated, but vindication came too late to save her life. Her final legacy is this: a reminder that justice corrupted is justice destroyed, and that the machinery of terror, once built, hungers endlessly for new victims.